Imagine discovering a file about your great-grandfather, not burned, not lost, not destroyed, sealed, locked away until the year 2075 you request access. You're denied, no explanation beyond one sentence. Restricted until further notice. What could possibly be inside a file that requires a century of silence? And why aren't you allowed to see it? Most people assume that when history disappears, it's because of accidents, fires, floods, war. But some records didn't vanish. They were intentionally sealed, stamped, archived, restricted across the United States and beyond. Thousands of historical files were locked away for 50, 75, even 100 years. Some remain sealed to this day. Adoption records, asylum admissions, juvenile, court files, wartime intelligence, documents, political investigations. And if your family's story intersects with one of those files, you may never know the full truth, because when records are sealed, time becomes a barrier, and sometimes by the time the barrier lifts, everyone involved is already gone. The practice of sealing records grew rapidly in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Officials argued it was necessary to protect privacy, to preserve dignity, to prevent scandal, and in many cases, that was true. But sealing records also did something else. It controlled narrative. Once a file is sealed, public scrutiny stops. Questions fade. Memory softens, and institutions decide when or if the truth becomes accessible. Some records were sealed for predictable reasons. Juvenile court files to protect minors, medical records to shield patients, but others sealed under vague authority, sensitive, confidential, national security. Broad terms, flexible terms, powerful terms, for much of the 20th century. Adoption records in many states were permanently sealed. When a child was adopted, the original birth certificate was often replaced, a new certificate issued, a new identity established, the original document locked away, in some cases, forever. For adoptees, this meant growing up without access to biological history, no knowledge of genetic medical risks, no certainty about ancestry, no clear answer to a simple question: who am I? Some fought in court for decades just to see their original records, and even when laws changed, access was often limited or partial. The intention may have been privacy, but the result was identity displacement. A person legally rewritten, not erased by fire, rewritten by policy. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, mental health institutions expanded rapidly. Asylums recorded admissions meticulously, names, diagnoses, family members' personal histories, but over time, many of these records were sealed or heavily restricted. Families often requested confidentiality to avoid stigma. Institutions restricted access to avoid liability, and in some cases, entire patient registries were classified for decades. For descendants trying to trace family history, this creates walls. A relative disappears into an institution. Records exist, but access is denied. Some historians argue sealing protected vulnerable individuals. Others question whether it also protected institutions from scrutiny, because some admissions may not have been voluntary. Some diagnoses may have been influenced by politics or gender norms or social pressure. And when those records are locked away, accountability is delayed. Sometimes permanently. Then there are the files stamped with heavier authority. Wartime intelligence. Records. Political surveillance documents. Reconstruction era. Investigations. Civil rights monitoring. Files classified, restricted for 75 years. 100 years, sometimes longer. Governments argue classification protects national security, and often that's valid. Classification also protects reputations. It shields decisions from immediate scrutiny, and it allows sensitive events to fade into distant memory before full disclosure when records are opened decades later. Context has changed, witnesses have died, public outrage has cooled, and the revelations feel distant. History becomes safer once those affected are no longer present to respond. There's a difference between destruction and delay. Fire destroys. Sealing controls. When a record burns, it's gone. When it's sealed, someone chooses when you can see it. That choice is power. Sealing records can protect individuals, but it can also protect systems. It can prevent panic, prevent lawsuits, prevent reputational damage, and it can delay difficult truths. In some cases, records are sealed long enough that by the time they're opened, they no longer threaten anyone in power. Time becomes a strategy, and silence becomes policy. For ordinary people, the impact is deeply personal. Imagine knowing there's a file with your name on it, but you can't read it. Imagine being told your original birth certificate exists, but you're not permitted access. Imagine learning your grandfather was investigated by the government, but the documents remain sealed until 2043. That uncertainty creates a unique kind of loss. Not absence, but withheld truth. And when families try to piece together history, sealed files become locked doors. Sometimes those doors open eventually, but by then, the people who could explain what happened are no longer alive. Answers arrive too late. How many sealed files still exist right now? In state archives, in federal vaults, in institutional basements, how many stories are sitting in folders marked restricted, waiting for a date decades in the future, not destroyed, not forgotten, just postponed? And who decided those timelines? Who chose 75 years or 100? And what might change if those files were opened tomorrow? You may never know what's inside your family's sealed file, because some truths are preserved, but not released. Some stories are documented but not disclosed. And some parts of history aren't erased by accident. They're managed, controlled, timed. If your ancestry hits a wall that isn't ash, if you find a reference to a file you cannot access, if you're told it exists but it's sealed, then the story isn't gone. It's waiting, and waiting can last longer than a lifetime, because history isn't only shaped by what's destroyed, it's shaped by what's delayed. And some records weren't sealed. They were quietly removed, destroyed, without announcement. But that's another story. But to understand why sealed records matter so much, you have to understand what they replace. When something is destroyed, people mourn the loss. When something is sealed, people live with uncertainty. And uncertainty can be heavier than absence, because absence ends the search. Sealing keeps the search alive. It keeps hope suspended. And hope, when blocked, becomes frustration. Governments and institutions often justify sealed records as protection. Protection of privacy, protection of minors, protection of national stability. And sometimes that protection is necessary, but protection and control can look similar. When you seal a record, you decide who gets access. You decide when it becomes public. You decide how much context surrounds its release. And you decide what narrative forms in the silence. Because when information is withheld, speculation grows. And speculation often fills the gaps left by secrecy. Throughout history, institutions have learned something simple. Time weakens outrage. If a scandal is exposed immediately, accountability follows quickly. If it's revealed 80 years later, the individuals involved are often gone. Careers ended naturally. Reputations solidified. Institutions are obeyed. And when the file finally opens, it becomes a historical curiosity, not a crisis, that delay changes. Everything it transforms present tension into distant memory, and that transformation is powerful because memory fades, but paper doesn't, if it's preserved in a vault for descendants. Sealed records create generational confusion. A grandmother refuses to speak about her childhood. A great-uncle disappears from family. PHOTOGRAPHSA sealed juvenile court file exists, but no one is allowed to read it, and so silence becomes inheritance. Children grow up sensing something missing, but without proof, without documents, without confirmation. Sealed records don't just block historians. They block families, they interrupt healing, they delay closure. And sometimes they protect secrets that families would rather confront than never understand. In some cases, sealing didn't just hide information, it reshaped identity entirely. Closed adoptions created new legal parents, original names replaced, original lineage concealed. For some, discovering sealed adoption records decades later meant uncovering entirely different cultural, ethnic, or medical histories. A life built on one story, then redefined by another. And when those records remained sealed, people were forced to live without that knowledge to make medical decisions, without full information to build identity on partial truth, to search for roots that the law itself had buried, even at the highest levels. Sealed records have shaped public understanding, intelligence, operations classified for decades, investigations hidden under national security, documents only released after mandatory declassification timelines expire. When those files surface, historians often discover policies or actions that would have sparked outrage in their own time. But decades later, they become academic discussion, detached, analyzed. Calmly, removed from urgency, the delay reshapes the emotional response, and that delay is built into the system. Not all secrecy is sinister. Some records truly protect vulnerable people. Victims of abuse. Juveniles. Private medical histories, but the ethical tension lies in duration. How long is protection necessary? And who determines when protection becomes concealment? 75 years, 100 years. Indefinite classification. Each timeline carries weight because every year sealed is another year of unanswered questions, another year of speculation, another year of incomplete history. There's something powerful about being told. You cannot access this. The human brain reacts strongly to restriction. Forbidden information feels more significant, more important, more urgent, and that reaction fuels curiosity, but it also fuels distrust, because when something is hidden, people assume it must be damaging, even if the reason is procedural. Sealing records doesn't just protect content, it changes perception. It alters how history is remembered, because what we cannot see becomes larger in imagination. Sometimes after decades, sealed records are released, boxes opened, folders examined, names revealed, and what's inside. Sometimes mundane bureaucracy, sometimes heartbreaking detail, sometimes institutional misconduct, sometimes simply misunderstood context, but the delay changes how it lands. The people directly affected are often no longer alive to respond, to defend themselves, to confront accusations, to explain circumstances. History becomes quieter when witnesses are gone, and that quiet is often intentional across different institutions. One pattern repeats. Immediate events are restricted. Time passes, restrictions expire, records open when impact is minimized. The pattern isn't always malicious, but it is consistent. And consistency suggests design. When governments, courts, and institutions all rely on delay as a mechanism, It becomes part of how history functions, not just what happened, but when you're allowed to know what happened. Somewhere right now, there may be a file with your family, name on it not burned, not missing, sitting quietly in a box stamped, dated restricted, and you may never see it. Not because it doesn't exist, but because someone decided its contents belong to another time. Maybe for protection, maybe for reputation, maybe for stability, or maybe for reasons that no longer apply. But the seal remains, and so does the question. Truth can survive 100 years of silence. And what changes when it finally speaks? History is not only shaped by what is destroyed, it is shaped by what is delayed, by what is hidden until outrage cools, by what is locked away until witnesses disappear, by what is preserved carefully but not shared. Because sometimes the most powerful form of erasure isn't fire, it isn't shredding, it isn't disappearance, it's time and time. When controlled, can be as effective as flame.